This looks interesting.
Dragon's Dogma was a digital D&D simulator released in 2012 by Capcom, originally for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. An expanded version of the game known as Dark Arisen was released about a year later for the same systems, and has since been ported to some newer consoles as well as PC, the version this review concerns. Dragon's Dogma has some of the most generic, surface-level presentation value, where if you take your eye off of it for 1 second, its natural camouflage will allow it to fade away from both sight and memory, like a zebra blending into a herd of other zebra. Its title, box art, and art style feel almost like something you'd see in the background of a movie as some kind of stereotypical fantasy video game prop, and not an actual real-life game. It may surprise you to discover that it is in fact a real-life game, and a pretty decent one at that, and once you've taken the time to actually play it, you may find it to be more memorable than it at first appears. It's an open-ish world action role-playing game featuring a player-designed main character with class-based character progression for melee, ranged, and magic-style fighting systems, as well as combination classes. At your side is a companion character called a pawn, whose appearance and battle style is also up to you to design, with the option to recruit the pawns of other players to fight alongside you, in addition to your own pawn doing the same for other players. The main story has the player character's heart stolen by a dragon, thus christening you as the Arisen, and embarking you on a quest to take it back with various side quests, jobs, and other activities to do along the way. The game was conceived and designed in a manner to distance itself from the more mainstream JRPG formulas of the time and embrace a more Western style of RPG design. It's no coincidence the initials of the game ended up being D&D, and the influence of Dungeons & Dragons and the other games which it inspired is quite clearly evident throughout Dragon's Dogma. And is it just me, or does the main theme motif sound remarkably similar to the overworld theme from the first couple Elder Scrolls games? It was a pretty hard sell though. Games like it weren't at all common in Japan at the time, because when you said you wanted to make an RPG, everyone thought Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy, and had little or no conception of something like the Elder Scrolls or Fable. Unsurprisingly, a lot of classic JRPG mainstays can still be found within Dragon's Dogma, some more contentious with Western conventions than others. Dragon's Dogma has a bit of a kitchen sink philosophy. It takes a lot of gameplay inspirations from other games such as item gathering and limb-specific weaknesses from Monster Hunter, and of course it's impossible not to be reminded of Shadow of the Colossus when scaling large enemies. On top of that, there are 9 different classes, each with their own special abilities and movesets, who can each have their own ancestry traced back into other games such as the Fighter's Burst Strike, which is evocative of a similar move from another Capcom property. Notably, however, you're able to swap in and out of each of them as often as you like with computer-controlled allies to join you on your quest in a manner not too dissimilar from something like a 3D rendition of Golden Axe. Now, if it sounds to you already like the game might have been a bit overly ambitious and perhaps a tad beyond its means, well, yeah, it was. But then if you take a look at what they had originally planned for the game, you have to wonder how anyone thought it would have been possible to implement all they had envisioned, especially on the hardware of the time. For instance, there was originally a glider system that you could use to traverse the environment similar to Breath of the Wild's paraglider. There was going to be an endless dungeon tower that connected everyone's worlds to one another. You were going to be able to travel to the moon, not to mention a bigger map with areas that would have been more filled out. But more than half of the original designs had to be cut, even going so far as to literally remove the moon from the night sky. A detail the anime seems to have missed. Because yes, there's an anime. It probably won't surprise you to hear that it's not very good for several reasons that I'm not going to get into. It's a pretty by-the-numbers adaptation of the game's story with a number of creative liberties taken, and you're better off just playing the game instead. There was also an MMO that I haven't been able to play because 1, it's exclusively in Japanese, and 2, the servers have since gone offline anyway, so I won't be covering that here. We've got enough to talk about. I'm going to preemptively date this video by mentioning that at the time of writing, the director Hideaki Itsuno's last big project was Devil May Cry 5, and one can only hope a sequel to Dragon's Dogma is at least part of the discussion for his next. The property shows amazing potential that you can easily see while playing through the game, and feel that what was left unfinished is just begging to come to fruition, and Itsuno has shown clear enthusiasm towards working on a sequel, so here's hoping. But with that, let's dive right in. You start the game as some nobody in a podunk fishing village, but then the dragon attacks and you're the only one stupid enough to take him on. For your bravery, the dragon decides to abduct your heart, which turns you half immortal with a very long list of side effects. Sort of like wearing a ring of power in the Tolkien universe. And if you want to get your heart back, you need to face the dragon. As I mentioned earlier, you can customize your character however you like, and I'll touch on that in more depth later, but the customization on offer is fairly decent. You can handily RP through the whole game as whoever you like.
Hello!
But because I'm boring, we'll just settle for the closest thing I can manage to a self-insert. I don't mean to spoil much in this review, but from here though, the main quest of the game is actually quite short and uneventful. After your heart gets stolen, you make your way to the Duke to join the hunt against the dragon, and you can kick the ox if you want it to go faster, by the way. Then you do a handful of seemingly disparate jobs for the duchy, and then the dragon just shows up and you go to face him. Obviously, the content of the interweaving quests and offshoot stories has a lot going on within them that sort of flesh out the world, but it's still a pretty bare-bones story, which may be an intentional holdover from those classic JRPG designs. Rather than the game focusing too heavily on its narrative, it prefers to let you soak in and enjoy the day-to-day goings-on of this fantasy world. Take on some jobs and explore at your leisure, which the game actively encourages when you reach Grand Soren and suggests you to just do some notice board quests while you wait to hear from the Duke. And this setup to me seems to draw some inspiration from Dragon Quest. Obviously, they've both got dragon in the title. The open structured nature seems pretty familiar. At one point you take orders from a king/duke who presents you with some treasures. There's a mission to rescue a princess, although for very different reasons, and you carry her around like this. And of course the antagonist who barely has any presence and pretty much only exists in conversation until the very end of the game. Now, obviously these are very different games, and these scenarios are almost nothing alike. However, I can't shake the impression that Dragon's Dogma was almost going for a somewhat more realistic reimagining of some of the core Dragon Quest themes and experiences, but to show off how it could be done with a more Western-style design philosophy. That of course is speculative, and it ignores all the other inspirations that clearly went into this game. Dragon Quest itself and many others of its ilk took inspiration from games like Dungeons & Dragons, Ultima, and Wizardry, which is very common when it comes to medieval fantasy RPGs, and as a result it's a bit difficult to make yourself stand out from the rest of the pack, especially when you try to stick to pure fantasy elements. So parallels are bound to pop up, especially considering that Capcom literally has a Golden Axe-style Dungeons & Dragons game that certainly could have been a source of some inspiration. But regardless, my point is that the story is almost secondary to the primary conceit of the game to create an enjoyable and varied fantasy environment as a conduit to have several small adventures within. That's why it's designed so generic and why you're encouraged to explore in a small party. It's an attempt to create something akin to a computer game equivalent to a D&D campaign like so many other Western RPGs, and it's delightfully self-aware with the dragon almost explicitly stating, "I'm only here because I have to be." The dragon himself is a very unique and compelling villain character. He's just a natural force. He doesn't show any sense of hatred or malice towards anyone. He understands that his role as a dragon is to destroy and that your role as a hero is to face him. He's just so well-spoken and polite. He understands the gravity of the situation and just wants to make sure you have a complete grasp as well, and to know for sure if you really are a bad enough dude to rescue your heart. The overarching narrative, such as it is, tries to go a step beyond and observe the whole fantasy hero's journey from the outside, and is sort of a commentary on the whole hero versus dragon mythos, and it tries to take some measures to address why that story is so often repeated and its many potential outcomes. And to talk about it much further would delve into spoiler territory, which I won't be going into here. But it is refreshing to see that when there are traces of a story, it tries to do something novel to transcend its cliché visage. There are further concepts explored in Dark Arisen, but honestly not much, and I really don't have much more to say about the story or even the lore of the world as a whole. It's there and has some fun and memorable moments, but much like many other parts of the game, feels sparse and underdeveloped. For instance, it's easy to get the feeling that a lot of the more eminent NPCs were supposed to have greater depth or be more important in some way, but past a certain point, most of them pretty rapidly lose most if not all significance and are promptly forgotten about. Any further depth they have might be inferred but is never really explored, and much of the story and lore of the game as a whole follows in that same vein. I'm reminded of the Elder Scrolls again and how they addressed this same issue, especially in the earlier games, by just having books that you could read that covered a range of topics from historical accounts, fictional novels, theatrical scripts, and even occupational manuals, and it made those worlds feel way more alive and real despite their technical limitations. Dragon's Dogma also has a few scattered descriptions of the world and histories buried in item descriptions and the like, but they're quite meager. Almost every landmark you come across feels hollow and lacking a sense of purpose. Your pawn companions might have a passing word to say about it, but beyond that it's just a piece of set dressing. This is punctuated by the fact that there are rarely any people around any of these places. Everyone important is in either Cassardis or Grand Soren, and everywhere else is either inhabited by monsters or a couple of guards or something. There might be one lone NPC of some import tucked away, but aside from that it's a pretty lonely country. Now there's nothing wrong with a centralized hub location where you can attend to most of your needs, but it'd be nice if the rest of the world wasn't quite so desolate. And this sense of emptiness isn't aided by the employment of port crystals. Port crystals in concept are a cool idea. You can place them wherever you want to have a fast travel location, and you can pick them back up and place them elsewhere as you please. In the original game, you would need to find fairy stones which would allow you to initiate the fast travel, but they were consumable, so you had to be considerate for when you wanted to use them up. Later on, they made the normal fairy stones obsolete by adding the eternal fairy stone, which lets you teleport as much as you please, which naturally has advantages and disadvantages. On the plus side, you no longer have to waste a bunch of time trekking across the world and running past enemies back and forth over and over again if you just want to knock out a few jobs or something. On the negative, it completely trivializes any sense of scale the game world is meant to have and completely messes up a lot of quests, especially the escort missions, where you can just drop a port crystal at the desired location, teleport into town to accept the quest, then teleport back to deliver the NPC. There are some decent built-in restrictions for the Eternal Fairy Stone, since you have to get to a location on foot at least once to even place the port crystal there. And the limited number of them for a first playthrough means that there can still be a meaningful amount of travel between less significant locations, or simply through choosing new spots to reposition your crystals. It's particularly nice if you're out in the field and want to teleport back into town and reorganize your supplies, and then pop back to where you were without much hassle. And it's only possible to do in the overworld, so it doesn't seriously undermine the weight management mechanic. But the reason I'm less enthusiastic about the existence of Eternal Fairy Stones to help reduce travel time is due to a deeper problem that a lot of open world games have, which is that getting around the world by any other means isn't particularly fun or interesting. There's no good middle ground between instant teleportation and trudging about on foot, and there's very little to do from one location to the next. And that's an important factor to consider when the game would have you repeatedly return to various locations multiple times for side quest objectives. Really makes you wish they could have gotten that paraglider idea put in somehow. Teleporting around is convenient, but it isn't very fun. But there is some stuff to do between locations, often small camps or structures with various different enemy types inhabiting them. You might stumble across a crossroads guarded by a Cyclops, or simply be wandering through the woods and minding your own business when a Chimera just walks out from behind a rock. It's moments like those that are most evocative of some random situation a dungeon master is likely to throw at you during a campaign. And while these are really fun to stumble across your first time, they're all predetermined placements, and once you know about them, the whole random charm disappears and turns into a potential enemy farming location. And that's just one of the limitations of the medium. Even if you were to widen the roaming area and randomize which enemy will show up, it's all still determinate in some way, lacking the flexibility and spontaneity of some sadistic DM's imagination. What exacerbates this limitation is that Dragon's Dogma doesn't have a huge amount of content, and what it does have, it likes to recycle. A lot. So it should probably come as no surprise that many of the enemies in the game have palette-swapped variants with adjusted stats and different weaknesses. A certain amount of iterative reuse is welcome, such as giving a Cyclops a helmet requiring you to alter your strategy of taking it down, or how the metal golem has its weaknesses spread out throughout an arena instead of on its body. And it makes sense to bolster common enemies to continue to put up a fight as you continue to get stronger. But the way that a Harpy, Snow Harpy, Siren, Succubus, Gargoyle, and Strigoi are all basically the same enemy, and all the different Saurian, Wolf, Goblin, and Undead variants just follow you all around the whole game world from beginning to end, gets tedious. And there are only a handful of larger creatures, which thankfully gets boosted up a bit in Dark Arisen, but the base game, not counting the tougher variants, well, let's see, you've got Cyclops, Chimera, Griffin, Cockatrice, the Dragon types, and Hydra. If you want to be generous, we can add Ogres, Golems, Wights, and the Evil Eye. Now, I want to stress that all these enemies are really well designed and fun to fight, but that's still a pretty small offering of 6 large-scale enemies and 4 mid-size. And of those, only a handful are actually possible to show up in the overworld. So I hope you really enjoy fighting Cyclops because you'll be seeing them quite often. And it's not just enemy variety that seems lacking. A lot of the game's locations tend to look quite similar as well. Even when you're not trekking back and forth through the same areas for a quest, there's just not a whole lot of differentiation. Most areas are grey and bleak with the same half-crumbling castle wall-like structures. It's at its worst in the Everfall and Dark Arisen's Bitter Black Isle, where they crafted some new-ish dungeon environments, but you'll be seeing the same rooms multiple times. In Dark Arisen, apart from almost every room getting reused, you literally have to go through the whole dungeon twice to get the true ending. Most of the enemies are different the second time through, but it's a tiring experience visually. Now there are, of course, exceptions, and some areas are pleasantly unique and don't demand much revisitation, such as the Witchwood and its clearly Berserk-inspired area with its golems out front and young witch inside the house. And naturally, other areas can look quite cool as well, but as I mentioned at the top of the video, the art design as a whole is painfully generic and unremarkable, making even the more inventive areas feel duller than they could have been. This seems to stem from the fact that the in-game visuals lack the fidelity required to execute what was laid out conceptually, in addition to many of the more unique and colorful designs ending up on the cutting room floor. I think one of the largest culprits is the overall desaturation in the final product, where most of the vibrancy and vitality of the concept art has been sucked out into duller, drab tones. While it's of course possible to be too vivid in your color palette, likewise it can also be too restrained, as I feel has happened here, where even the more colorful designs feel too realistically dingy, if that makes sense. It certainly wasn't complemented by the broad open emptiness that the whole world evinces. Thankfully, you don't have to travel this somewhat bleak world alone, which brings us nicely to the topic of pawns. Near the start of the game, you create a second companion character to join you on your journey, and you can freely set and change their class and equipment throughout the game. And as they experience the game with you, they'll gain knowledge of quests and monsters, allowing them to perform more effectively for you or for other players who may desire to hire them. Don't stress too hard about you or your pawn's design, however, as there are opportunities where you can change your names and appearances if you have second thoughts. Other players' pawns can be found wandering around the world on the roads or within camps or cities. But there are also stones scattered about that will transport you to the pawn nexus, where you can browse through as many pawns as your vacant heart desires, or even look up someone in particular, which is useful if a pawn you liked having around gets unexpectedly launched off a cliff. Or if one of your pawns were to, say, use one of your rare cure-alls, then accidentally trip and fall into the brine in the middle of a mission. You can hire up to 2 other pawns at a time, and since you can change you and your own pawn's classes and skills at any time, you effectively have complete control over however you want to set up your party and redesign it as you please. So you can get a good balance of classes or try to run through with a tank brigade of warriors. The only concern being stat growths, which change depending on which class you are at the time of a level up. Pawns were conceived to bring the feeling of an online bulletin board or forum to the online multiplayer. This sort of transient approach to a faux multiplayer was an unusual feature at the time, as the team was working on it well before things like the Souls games or social games for mobile devices, which have since made this sensibility more prominent, began popping up. Before this, the concept of multiplayer was basically some kind of matchmaking or real-time co-op and maybe a leaderboard. Though the pawn system is still a very unique feature to Dragon's Dogma and is one of the most interesting parts of the game because they interact with almost all the same things in the world that you can. They'll pick things up off the ground, search through gathering spots, open up and loot chests. They'll provide battle commentary as well as useful strategic information. And of course they can fight the enemies, capable of scaling them just as you can, and if they've got enough experience with a particular enemy, they'll know which weaknesses to target and can aid the team by casting specific elemental enchantments. If you decide to break a bunch of boxes in front of them in search of goodies, they'll learn to smash stuff all on their own. Give them a pickaxe and they'll mine ore deposits. Give them empty flasks and they'll fill them up with healing spring water and use them up whenever the party needs it. They're actually quite liberal with using any and all items you give them. It's equal parts hilarious and frustrating to be in the middle of a completely safe city and have a pawn use one of your valuable potions that can cure any ailment and completely restore health because they decided to jump into a fountain and got wet.
I will dispel the ailment.
Be gone!
Pawns overall tend to feel pretty robotic with how often they repeat the same phrases, but their actions can communicate a lifelike intelligence and give rise to memorable situations. Stand still for long enough and eventually they might walk up to you and check to see if you're still there. If you get carried up into the air by a harpy and wriggle free, a particularly clever pawn can catch you just before you hit the ground so you won't take any fall damage, and they're just full of little surprises like that. Whenever you rest at an inn, you can get an update on what other players your pawn has helped, as well as receive ratings for their performance, and maybe even receive a gift, which conversely you have a chance to offer to others whenever you retire another player's pawn who you've had in your party. You can even talk to your own pawn about some of their behaviors and encourage them to be more aggressive, defensive, cocky, or meek. It's almost like raising a virtual pet, and you can gain a pretty substantial bond with them throughout the game, which is pretty interesting considering that even the game considers them soulless puppets. Speaking of soulless, the Arisen him or herself doesn't express much or even have much of any character at all. You might as well be a hunk of wood. People only seem to acknowledge you because your status as the Arisen and your ability to swing a sword, not because you're fun to talk to. This, again, is a pretty common setup in most JRPGs. Some stone-cold, emotionless psycho traipses around the world and vanquishes some ancient eldritch avatar of chaos that's plagued the world for 1,000 years, without so much as a whisper of intelligent thought beneath the veil of his or her barren gaze. You might get a look of shock every once in a while, but that's just the result of the primordial reptilian brain kicking in. But on the other hand, you are quite literally heartless. The silent protagonist trope has been picked apart countless times, and it has its benefits, but I would also have appreciated some deeper connection to the reputation mechanic besides the barest minimums of giving gifts and doing favors to increase relation, and physical abuse to decrease it. Some more advanced dialogue options could have helped this and given a better sense of personality to your Arisen. But alas, the choices you can possibly make are all pretty black and white and or have very little significance. It's one of those more ingrained tropes that stubbornly persisted in just about every RPG from Japan. And if there were any change to be made to make an RPG feel more Western, as was part of the goal, it would be some kind of dialogue selection system. I don't fault the game for not having one, especially with how light the narrative elements are, but I've always been curious to see an Eastern take on that style, and this is the kind of game where I could see it being used effectively. Now, I've been mostly negative about this game so far because the game absolutely has many flaws, and you can tell that they really did have to cut huge chunks of the game out, and even what remains can still feel deeply hollow when unfinished. For example, other places and nations are mentioned in the game along with their respective representatives, but you can't actually visit any of them. Just before a quest teases that you'll be leaving the country of Grandiose to go elsewhere, a guard runs up and is like, "Nah, just kidding, we need you to stay here." And the end of the main story follows in quick succession. But despite all of its many shortcomings, I'd still say Dragon's Dogma is a good game, or at least the shadow of one, and the demand fans have for a sequel stems from the promise of what the game could have been, and for which it shows great potential. That potential is clearly visible in the surprisingly robust pawn system that we've already discussed, but in many other facets as well. And it begins almost straight away with character creation, which not only is reasonably well featured and offers a decent amount of variety, but can have actual gameplay significance. If your character is short, they can squeeze through a select few passageways in the game to unlock shortcuts, but they're susceptible to getting drenched easier in rivers and streams, and getting their lantern snuffed out or getting knocked over by strong winds from things like a griffin's wings. Larger and heavier characters can carry more weight before being overburdened, but their stamina replenishes a bit slower, and of course they can't fit through small openings. On top of that, you can carry other characters to stop. Also, beware of your party's sexes, because normal ogres become enraged at the sight of women, and elder ogres become enraged at the sight of men. And you can just write your own joke for that. But naturally, when it comes to customizing your character, your combat vocation might be the most important, and it doesn't much matter which one you pick because
The master works all, you can't go wrong.
you might think some of the classes are outclassed by their advanced counterparts, but even the starter classes have their distinct advantages. You can easily swap in and out of vocations at an inn and even mix and match some of the augments and abilities between them, so there's a lot to explore when it comes to the nuances of how you want to design your character's setup. But let's just briefly touch on what each can do and some of their most notable abilities. Fighter is good at drawing aggro of all the enemies in order to let magic users cast their spells. Their shield can be used to vault other members up to higher places, and in general they're able to deal out a lot of damage really quickly while being able to avoid physical attacks with ease. In most games, archer classes kinda suck and are slow and boring to play as, but not so in Dragon's Dogma. In addition to being able to shoot 5 arrows per volley, the Strider can fire arrows directly into the air and rain down on the enemy from above. Apart from that, they can steal items off of enemies and utilize daggers to rapidly slash away at the enemies until they unlock the ultimate ability of turning themselves into a living buzzsaw. Mages cast spells, obviously, but the magic in Dragon's Dogma works a lot differently than in most games. You need to be able to avoid interruption while you charge up your spell and then cast it. The bigger the spell, the longer it takes to cast. Mages in general usually have smaller spells which they can cast faster. They can cast enchantments on your party's weapons, summon zones of healing, and of course, pin an enemy down in place whilst choking it with miasma, smiting it with lightning, or summoning giant pillars of ice. Magic gets a lot cooler with Sorcerer, but Mage still comes packed with a lot of the most useful and frequently needed spells, and can cast them all out in a flash. Warrior is the tank, and comes equipped with the heaviest armor and large two-handed weapons which can deal the highest weapon damage in the game, but are of course much slower than one-handed weapons. Thankfully, during their windups they can sustain a bit of damage and swing through enemy attacks to chunk health bars down to nothing, and nothing feels quite as sweet as landing a well-timed arc of obliteration. Apart from that, it's incredibly enjoyable to just cruise through normal enemies and one-shot them with the old jump and thump. One weapon in the game, the Heracles, has a chance of doing 9 times damage on hit, and when the warrior boosts their damage with Conqueror's Periaps and then manages to land a crit, well... What's better than firing 5 arrows at once? Why, firing 10 arrows, of course. Rangers use longbows for more firepower at a slower rate of fire. They can fire arrows in a spread, inflict poison-tipped arrows, and charge up to fire super strong arrows, some of which they can steer or fire in a corkscrew. Basically, all the bow abilities you wish you could have in other games. Apart from utilizing the most broken spell in the game, Holy Focused Bolt, Sorcerer can use some of the coolest spells in any game ever. Most of them are pretty situational, and combined with their extremely long cast times are not often worth taking with you, especially with how stupidly overpowered Holy Focused Bolt is. But despite this, quite honestly, the visuals speak for themselves and are still capable of completely obliterating enemies in very short order. Every sorcerer remembers the first time they called down a hailstorm of meteors and summoned an enormous tornado to juggle enemies in the air. Assassin is much like Strider, but with more focus on melee rather than ranged. They can switch out to a sword and shield if desired, making it easy to swap in and out of combat styles on the fly. They have a greater emphasis on speed to teleport behind your enemies, and is overall a really good class to choose for adventuring solo. It also has the highest strength stat increase when you level up. Mystic Knight is a great choice if you're the type of person who hates a consistent frame rate. His magic cannon fires magic damaging orbs whenever anything hits it, and he also has access to an ability which lays a seal on the ground that causes damage to anything that crosses it. So, if you set up your magic cannon inside your shield and an enemy crosses the barrier, they will first be receiving damage that you've been firing from the cannon normally, then they'll take damage from the seal, and the seal will also strike the magic cannon, firing even more damage back at the enemy. And your game will satisfyingly chug its way through machine gun magic fire. If the ranger wasn't busted enough, now you've got magic on your side. Apart from the obvious enchantments on your arrows dealing magic damage, you can now turn your arrows into splitting seeker missiles, delayed explosives, or make them ricochet off the walls in every direction. And now instead of simply throwing pawns you don't like into the brine, you can sacrifice their life in exchange for one ultra-powerful shot. But if there's one standout ability that Magic Archer has that wolves absolutely hate, it's Immolation, where you set yourself on fire, cling onto your baddie of choice, and stab the hell out of them with your daggers until they succumb to your purging flames. Great for burning off the wings of flying enemies or lighting up a cave if you forgot to bring extra oil for your lantern. Apart from the assortment of vocations to choose from, the various different abilities that weapons have also increases depth by offering more choices for how to build your character's fighting style, and that's part of the reason why every class is a good choice and can be made into an endgame superstar. I already mentioned the Iroquois, which increases the damage you take by 50% in exchange for a 1 in 4 chance of boosting attack power by 9-fold. But you've also got things like the Rusty weapons, which once upgraded can give your enemies a nasty case of tetanus and inflict torpor, which reduces their speed significantly. And then there's the Force Hatchet, which allows you to increase your damage by up to 100% with each successful hit, without taking damage yourself, which is a great choice for Assassin who can utilize the effect to then make some distance and double their bow damage. And how about the Maker's Finger, a single extremely valuable arrow that can be used to insta-kill almost any enemy in the game with the exception of some bosses. The list goes on, and there's just a ton to discover and play around with. Not every ability is some endgame overpowered godslayer, but they're just fun to take for a spin and experiment with and find interesting, if niche, use cases. And that's reflective of a lot of Dragon's Dogma's design. Tons of really small details and mechanics that have very small and isolated uses, but add an air of unpredictability to make you question what else may be possible if you go out of your way to poke around a bit. This brings us to another very interesting mechanic that you don't really see in many games. A specific shop called the Black Cat is able to take any item and make a false duplicate of it for a certain fee, and depending on what you decide to make a forgery of can have certain positive or negative effects. For instance, there's a quest early on where you're tasked with searching for some legendary sorcerer's grimoire, and after you've found it, you may recall the Black Cat's services and be tempted to have a forgery made of it. Then you can hand in the forgery to the quest giver and keep the real one for yourself. You may feel quite clever for having thought of doing such a thing, and you'll complete the quest then get your reward no problem, so it seems like that's the way to do it. But what you may not have realized is that your treachery will have consequences, as later on in the game, Stefan the quest giver will attempt to come to your aid in a griffin hunting quest, and if you gave him the fake book, his spell will fizzle out and he'll become very upset with you. But if you gave him the real book, he will actually be able to cast useful spells to help you out during the fight, even though you probably don't need it. It turns out if you kept the book, you could cast one particular spell one time only, so it's just better to leave it with Stefan to help you out at that moment, since you can always just unlock that spell normally to use it as you please by leveling up your sorcery vocation. You'll also save yourself 30,000 gold. But what's notable about all this is that it highlights that you're not rewarded for your cleverness by remembering the forgery shop and taking advantage of poor Stefan. Instead, you're rewarded for making the moral choice and giving him the book as promised, rather than being greedy and trying to cheat him. Now, the forgery shop can be used to good effect for certain quests, giving a bad guy a fake version of something, or even claiming a quest reward twice by giving opposite parties the same thing, real or fake. Sometimes they just can't tell the difference and you get away scot-free. But many times the forgery path can actually backfire against you. You may complete the quest and keep the bauble, but lose out on something else later. Or maybe the cost of creating the forgery outweighs the potential benefit it can net you. Maybe you don't want to farm your way through a bunch of materials, and rather just get one and then forge the rest. So it's a very interesting mechanic when considering what you can forge, but also if you should forge. At the very least, it can pay to keep the Black Cat in your thoughts throughout the game. This brings us rather gracelessly to item and weight management. While certainly a bit annoying to deal with, it's paired with a great deal of considerations and streamlining to make it fairly painless while retaining the intended function that it adds to the rest of the gameplay. You can store an almost infinite supply of items in your storage at an inn, which is additionally painless by automatically defaulting to storing the full stack of items. So you can essentially just mash the same button over and over to empty your inventory into storage, and then take out any items as needed. This is also complemented by places like upgrade stores, which can require certain items to be able to upgrade something, but will automatically search through both your inventory and your storeroom to use the items without you needing to withdraw them. So you'll have to deal with weight limits and inventory constraints while you're in the field, but once you return to base and store everything away, you get the benefits of having the items on hand without the weight constraints. You can hold on to as much as you want as long as you want, and not really have to fiddle with needlessly going back and forth between shops, inventory, and storage. If you think something could be useful in the future, just pop it into storage and you can pretty much forget about it. The game will let you know if you need it, how much you have of it, and then use it up if necessary. The exception would be items like curatives, armor, and quest items and other tools, but that's the whole purpose of a weight limit, to make you consider what you want to weigh yourself down with to begin before you even begin collecting other treasures or resources. It's a very well streamlined system that still requires a fair amount of inventory and UI usage, but it's very quick, intuitive, and well designed that makes it very satisfying to collect items and then just chuck them into your storeroom for later without needing to put much thought into it. And the weight limit as well has noticeable effects on other parts of the game too. With high load, your stamina will deplete faster and regenerate slower. Your movement speed overall will be slower, and if you become overburdened, you'll be restricted to a very slow walk. So it can certainly be of great use to hire larger pawns and use them as pack mules since they can carry more weight. And while that kind of allocation of items and resources may seem tedious and boring, I find it pretty fun and interesting to negotiate the trade-off of micromanaging my weight management between all the members of my party in accordance to how greedy I feel about looking around and collecting more stuff before heading back to an inn. But that just about exhausts all there is left to say. As you can probably tell by now, Dragon's Dogma has an incredibly sturdy framework, but as explored earlier, precious little was built off of it due to the drastic cuts that had to be made to deliver a finished project within budget. While it's impressive to see things like how they developed technology to apply the same animations to different skeletons, which increased character customizability and reduced animation workload, and going above and beyond when it comes to diversifying combat and infusing it with that rad Capcom energy and cool factor, they still fell short of being able to create a world that was as large and dense enough that a game like this sort of needs to be. But of course, this was the first foray for the team as well as the Japanese market at large into the world of the action RPG, with a lot of lessons to learn from along the way that made development very challenging. And it was remarked that even fellow members of Capcom had trouble understanding what would be appealing about the game's battle mechanics and pawn system right up until it was released and they could see it in action. Dragon's Dogma has some genuinely great moments, mechanics, and concepts, but the limitations, restraints, and severe cuts that it underwent during development held it back from being much more than a curiosity with an endless list of what-ifs. Like, what if Conqueror's Periaps and Blast Arrows didn't completely break the game? What if stocking up on Springwater and making your pawns carry a bunch didn't almost obliterate your entire party's health concerns? What if Holy Focused Bolt wasn't so and the list goes on. The devotion fans, whom I would consider myself one of, have towards the game seems to be less for what the game is and more for what the game could be, and is the reason why what is done to make the game work at its core so laudable, and the desire for a sequel so strong. While it's definitely understandable how the myriad shortcomings and flaws the game has could be more than some players are willing to bear, if you're able to look past all that, push against the wind, and seek out those oh-so-sweet hidden treasures, there's a good chance it might just steal your heart.
I can't believe you committed suicide. I cannot believe you committed suicide. How could you have done this? How could you have committed suicide?